Throughout all Western music, the well-tempered chromatic scale is the source of all the notes we have to compose with. This is true of all tonal music, regardless of what style or genre it may be. The chromatic scale consists of 12 tones in half or semitone intervals. It usually starts with C and ascends to B. In 12-tone music, which fundamentally differs from tonality, we also use the chromatic scale, but the order that the notes are arranged is different. They're ordered so that no note is repeated until all 12 are stated. This arrangement is referred to as the row or series. It's the basis for both melodic and harmonic elements. The 12-tone method was developed by Arnold Schoenberg in the 1920s. The styles leading up to this included chromaticism, prevalent in the late 19th century, then atonality, which began in the early 20th. But the 12-tone method redefined how music would be structured. It was the first real departure from the tonal practices of the past. Before all of that, there was traditional tonality. In fact, it is still widely used today to compose all kinds of music, from classical to popular. 12-tone music didn't replace tonality, it just became another method to use along with the other methods. There is a great deal written about tonal music already. It's taught in most schools, and there are countless textbooks on this subject. It's been the method used for composing music for over 400 years. There's been surprisingly little written about 12-tone method in comparison to tonality. My intent with this video then is to present the basics of the 12-tone method, also referred to as serial music. I believe a better understanding of its essentials is the best way to appreciate it while listening to it. But there shouldn't be any attempt to associate all the techniques we'll cover in this video with 12-tone music as you listen to it. Instead, you should just listen to it as you would any other music, free of any analysis or need for explanations. Let it just be music, and take from it whatever you find. It can mean different things to different people. Because you will most likely be unaccustomed to its differences from tonal music, you may find it difficult to hear at first. But in time, and with a better understanding of what goes into it, you may begin to find it enjoyable. The starting point is the row or series. It orders all the tones in the chromatic scale in such a way that none is repeated until all are stated. This is called the prime or original row. Besides being an ordering of all 12 tones, it is also a series of intervals. An interval is simply the distance between two tones. There are 3 variations or permutations derived from this prime row that constitute the core of all the variations to follow. The first variation of the prime row is called the retrograde. This is the prime row stated in reverse. Next is the inversion. This is the prime row inverted, meaning all the intervals in the prime row are turned upside down. The last variation is the retrograde inversion. This is the inversion row stated in reverse. To provide more source material to compose with, these 4 rows are subjected to even more variations. The most common is transpositional, which takes the first row, be it P, R, I, or R, I, and transposes it up a half or semitone. This is repeated until you arrive back at the first row. It creates an array of 12 tones. This transpositional array is repeated for the remaining 3 row variations. When all 4 rows have been transposed in this manner, you have a total of 48 rows in 4 sets of arrays called the matrix. The transpositional method is not the only method for generating more row variations. Various composers since Schoenberg have developed other methods, like Stravinsky's rotational arrays. If you want to learn more about these advanced methods, I will recommend 3 books that cover 12-tone composition in depth. The prime row can start on any note you want. The order is only limited by the no repeat rule. You can arrange the notes any way you want as long as you follow that rule. The first note of the prime row, regardless of which note that is considered the reference pitch. There are usually integers or numbers associated with each note in the row. The first note or reference pitch is always 0. Each number after that is the number of semitones from the reference pitch. For instance, in our example, the reference pitch is G, which is assigned the integer 0. The next note is B flat, which is 3 semitones from the reference pitch and therefore assigned the number 3. This numbering scheme is repeated for all 12 notes in the row. These number associations remain for the remaining 3 variations. There are 2 other basic rules that apply to the notes in a row. The first is octave equivalence. The second is enharmonic equivalence. Octave equivalence means that regardless in what octave or register a note appears, it is part of the same family or class of notes. 12-tone music doesn't distinguish the note by what octave it is positioned at, as does tonal music. All the same named notes, regardless of octave, are in the same pitch class. To illustrate octave equivalence and to help better understand the integers used to identify each pitch, we'll use modulo 12 arithmetic. Now, before you stop this video for fear I'm going to get into math, wait a minute. Trust me, I'm not one who recklessly throws math around like that. I suck at math and assume most people don't have a particular love of it either. But I'll show you through a simple illustration how it works, and we'll look at it with something you see every day. The best illustration to explain modulo 12 is the clock face. Here's an example. In our prime row, G is the reference pitch, or 0. The next note is B flat, up 3 semitones given the number 3. If that B flat were an octave higher, it would actually be a 15. An octave is the distance of 12 semitones. The B flat, that is a 3, would be a 15, an octave higher because 3 plus 12 equals 15. If you look at the clock face and start at 3, then move clockwise by 12 positions, you end up back at 3. So you're probably saying, who cares? Well, to keep the integers in the range of 0 through 11, we use modulo 12 arithmetic. Why do we want to keep the integers between 0 and 11? Well, because we will use these to do other things with, which I'll get into briefly later in this presentation. Enharmonic equivalence means that the function of an accidental, which is a sharp or flat, is only limited to either raising or lowering a note by a semitone. In tonal music, an A sharp is considered a different pitch than a B flat, even though they sound identical. The reason is that in tonal music, we use key signatures to conform the notes to fit the appropriate scale pattern. In 12-tone music, no key signatures are used. There are no scales like major or minor that have their own distinct patterns. Therefore, 12-tone music treats an A sharp and a B flat as equivalent. Intervals, too, are stated differently in 12-tone music than they are in tonal music. In tonal music, intervals are described in terms of their relationship to the diatonic scale. For instance, the interval from B to F sharp is considered a perfect fifth. In 12-tone music, it's considered a 7, because the F sharp is 7 semitones from B. However, most composers and musicians still refer to it in the context of the diatonic relationships. Sometimes old habits are hard to break. In reality, tonal music is guided by many more rules than 12-tone music is. In many respects, 12-tone music is freer and less constrained making it a more challenging method to compose with. As is becoming apparent, for those schooled in traditional tonal methods, 12-tone music is a bit of a challenge. Not because it's so difficult, but because it's so different from what they've always known. For some, no rules is liberating. For others, it's scary. It takes some relearning. You need a different mindset. It's hard to abandon the old and familiar and embrace the new and unfamiliar, to once again face the learning curve you thought you have already been through. That's one of the reasons musicians especially have been reluctant to get into it. But students just coming up don't have to unlearn tonality. They tend to be more receptive to 12-tone music. They just need to better understand it. Let's take a look at another important aspect of 12-tone music, and that's pitch class. This has to do with octave and enharmonic equivalence that we talked about earlier. Because of these equivalences, all the pitches of the same name are in the same pitch class. That simply means that all the G-flat notes, for instance, regardless of which octave they're at, or whether they're spelled G-flat or F-sharp, are all in the same bucket we refer to as pitch class. Now, all of these concepts we've been talking about are not something that's consciously used when composing 12-tone music. They're simply explanations of why we structure the pitches the way we do, and why we arrange their order in the manner we describe. They don't always apply to how they're used when composing. Two of the most important aspects of music are melody and harmony. In traditional tonal music, which everyone is most familiar with, both harmony and melody are based on the scale, whether major, minor, or any other variation. The only source of pitches in 12-tone music is the row or series. Both melody and harmony are derived from the row. Here's an example of a flute melody using the example prime row. Here's that same melody with the integers identified. In this example, we took the prime row as ordered and created a simple melody from it. In reality, not repeating a note until all 12 are stated is a rule that only applies to creating a row, not in using it. In fact, any note can be repeated as many times as the composer wishes. As I said, it's not a rule for composing, it's a rule for describing the method. Since harmony is also derived from the row, let's look at an example of how I've used the row to establish harmony. Here we're using the same flute melody, but the piano plays chords based on both the retrograde and inversion variations of the prime row. Harmony can also be what results from multiple melodies occurring simultaneously, which is most often called counterpoint. Here's an example from my composition Reliquary for Elliott Carter for string quartet. In the post-war years, serial composers wanted to differentiate their music from what had come before. Therefore, there was little to no suggestion of melodic or harmonic elements, at least in the way we've come to recognize them. Their work emphasized a more pointillist approach, where the notes were much like the points of color in a pointillist painting. But subsequent 12-tone music evolved to have more melodic and harmonic elements as part of their structure. Rather than differentiate from what came before, it continued the tradition, only with the language of the 12-tone method. The rules may have changed, but the effect was the same. The essential similarity is how melody and harmony relate to their source. In tonal music, it's the scales. In 12-tone music, it's the row. In that respect, the two methods have much in common. One musical element that 12-tone composers really expanded on was rhythm. In this regard, there was a real break from tradition. Composers explored more complex and intricate rhythmic elements. The new sound structures almost demanded a new sense of rhythm. Composers rose to that challenge with some astounding new rhythmic structures to complement the new sound. They didn't regard rhythm as a separate thing. A series of pulses doesn't mean much by itself, but when these rhythmic values are linked to other sources, it's a different story. When they're associated with a series of pitches, it takes on a different meaning. They interact with each other. Unlike tonal music, where rhythm is characterized by periodicity, meaning occurrences at regular intervals, in serial music it is characterized by irregular pulses. When we talk about rhythm, we're really talking about temporal intervals, where temporal is relating to measured time. That's the distance between an initiation of a musical event, like an attack, that we perceive as pulse. The actual duration of these events, whose initiations set the pulse, is less significant. While we don't want to prescribe every detail of rhythmic behavior, there are some suggestions for making rhythmic surfaces in serial music. It's generally advised to use a lot of rhythmic aperiodicity, or occurrences at irregular intervals, whether it's meter, beat division, foreground rhythm, or a combination of these. This doesn't mean that regular pulsation should be avoided, but rhythmic periodicity is more the exception in serial music. Anything exceptional usually calls attention to itself, so any rhythmic regularity you use in serial music is best at significant moments, not casually tossed in wherever or whenever. Typically, sequential rhythmic repetition should be avoided, and certainly one such gesture shouldn't follow another identical or almost identical one. Usually, a typical question and answer phrase division, inherited from the tonal music of the past, is viewed somewhat metaphorically. Generally, you shouldn't go beyond roughly balancing phrase halves and avoid literal repetition. There is a distinction between irregularity of meter and irregularity of metric subdivision, or the succession of beats and the way they're subdivided. Both are useful in making and ornamenting the surface of a composition. When we talk about the surface of a composition, what we mean is this. We not only identify the succession and combination of sounds in the foreground, but we also sense a more deeply buried background, which is a more general and abstract network of relationships. Actually, we're aware of a multiplicity of layers, not just these two. In a well-written piece, these are in lively communication with each other. This foreground is what we refer to as the compositional surface. Something else to consider. The effect of tempo on the kinds of rhythmic unfolding we've been talking about is very marked. In most cases, we've assumed a moderate to fast rate because it's at these speeds the perception of larger units of temporal succession are most easily recognized. At slower tempos, regularity is much less obtrusive, unless it's really emphasized, like using bass drum thumps. The periodic-aperiodic continuum can provide a composer with a choice as to just where to locate his piece. These rhythmic situations generally apply to serial music, but are in no way cast in stone. As with all other elements of serial music, there are no hard and fast rules. What we've been talking about is extrapolated from the many serial compositions written since the method's beginnings. The fact that register is not a differentiating factor in stating a pitch class allows us to place a note in any octave. Rhythmic patterns that allow that to happen, as in the case of a tempo capable of letting these octave jumps be heard and recognized, becomes a consideration, both from a perception and execution viewpoint. A musician can execute these octave jumps more successfully at a tempo slow enough to allow it. If the tempo is too fast, these executions become more difficult and less likely to be recognized by the listener. In short, irregular rhythms are more prominent in serial music than regular rhythms. A lot of things need to be considered in choosing any rhythmic patterns in serial music, more because of its nature tending more toward interval ordering than interval content. The best thing for the listener to do to better understand this is to listen to a variety of serial compositions from a variety of composers. This will do more to acquaint the listener to the vastly different approaches to 12-tone music. It will clearly show how challenging composing serial music is, not because it's so confining with many rules to follow, but because it's so liberating with only a few rules to be concerned with. In my humble opinion, it has many more possibilities than tonal music has at this point in time. Tonality, with over 400 years of history, has served us well, and in many cases still does. But serial or 12-tone music offers possibilities not available within the realm of tonal triadic harmonic practices. It's certainly worth getting to know better. I hope this presentation has helped to do that. Here are 3 books I feel will provide a more in-depth look into the serial 12-tone method, and will show how this music has evolved from its beginnings in Vienna in the 1920s to the present day. I hope you enjoyed that video and found it very informative. My goal was to present a very basic overview of the 12-tone method. The 3 books I suggested would give you a much more in-depth look if you are so interested. So until the next time, thanks very much for watching.